Hello everyone, this is a close-up look of the TRS-80 Radio Shack Color Computer 2. This particular model is a later model that includes the extended color basic. It's a 16K model. Like most of the computers of the era, pretty much, keyboardish single system with the ability to connect various aftermarket or peripherals. Pretty standard things. Power is actually integrated into the system, so that's nice. There's no power brick, just a power cord coming out of the back. Power switch, your standard television connector here. Left and right joysticks ports, serial I/O port, cassette port, reset switch, and of course, a reliable cartridge port. I never really owned a Coco back in the day, so I don't know a whole lot about this computer, but we're going to give it a little fire up and we'll talk about what little bit I do know. Give it a little demonstration. So let's just start that. And power. And we're greeted by a nice little basic screen. Interesting thing about this computer compared to many in the area is that instead of a flashing cursor that would blink on and off or a blinking underline, this actually cycles through colors. It's a solid block, but it cycles through colors. I found that kind of interesting. It's 1982. This particular model is a 16K model, and it has, as I said, the extended basic RAM. Not a whole lot of excitement there. So what can we say about this? Well, what can we say about the TRS-80 Color Computer 2? Well, a few things. First of all, an interesting thing about this computer was that, unlike a lot of the computers of the age, this one is actually based on a Motorola chip, the 6809, which is a precursor to the 68000 series. For those of you in technology, you'll probably have recognized that. If you're not, it's not that big of a deal, but the important thing is this is a different CPU than the majority of these machines built at the time. The majority of the machines built at the time, for the home market in particular, were based on the CMOS 6502 architecture, Western Design Center 6502 architecture. Almost all of your very popular machines of that era, Commodore, Apple, Nintendo Entertainment System, Atari 2600, etc. Almost all of those, actually all of those and more, were based on the CMOS 6502 set of some derivative thereof. The other bigger player in that time was the Motorola. Oh, sorry, not Motorola. The Z80 chip. The Z80 chip was a pretty big alternate that was used in other things like the Sinclair and other computers. A lot of your CP/M machines were Z80 based. In fact, the Commodore 128 has a Z80 in it as well, which is why it can actually execute CP/M as without out of the box. It's one of the 3 modes that it supports. So this machine though has a completely different chip. It's not a bad chip, but it is different, which set it apart. The graphics capabilities of the machine were reasonable for the era. The sound, from what I could tell, seemed reasonable as well. The BASIC, as you saw on the entry screen, a Microsoft derivative, so Microsoft BASIC was everywhere. I'm sure it was some sort of licensing deal. How much they paid, I don't know. How much they tweaked it to work on their machine, I do not know. It has color commands, it had sound commands, at least the extended color basic that's on that machine appears to. There were various different sets of ROMs that could come with your machine. That was another interesting thing about this particular brand, if you will, is that, like a lot of things in the era, especially earlier, they did things like have alternate amounts of RAM available and alternate chipsets, alternate ROMs available that you could order your machines with or upgrade them to. So this was not a model that caught on well long term for a few reasons. In one of them being, it was a way to save money, right? If I don't have a whole lot of money, I can buy the 16K version because RAM was expensive. I can manufacture it up, and I can, it's a lot less expensive than the 64K version. The downside of this is that when you have multiple models of the same machine with different ROMs and particularly different RAMs, you end up with what I would call the least common denominator syndrome. And the least common denominator syndrome is very simple, and I can speak to it firsthand. When you're a software developer, you want your device to be able to run on as many devices as possible because that's your market. You want your market to be as large as possible. So what you end up doing is you have a lot of stuff being written for the lowest common denominator. So in the world of the color computer too, for example, um, most of your software is going to be written for the 16K footprint of RAM, for the DOS. I'm sorry, the DOS, not the basic ROM or the kernel ROM that is in all machines or supported by all. These extended ones, it adds a confusion. It adds a confusion to the consumer. It adds a confusion to the marketplace. I'm not saying people didn't write software for all these different things. I know they did. But you end up with a focus being on, I want the least common denominator to be my target. Well, if I have a 16K machine and a 64K machine, even if all other things are equal, I will not get the same caliber of outputted software when my goal is to run on 16K versus 64. That's just reality, folks. Same thing if you have multiple versions of ROM. I'm going to try to make my stuff work on the minimal ROM that everybody, the minimal basic that everybody has. If I'm using the basic ROMs, for example, I will say that another interesting thing I found about this machine, this is one of the few machines that didn't have, at least that I could find, a whole lot of direct ports for arcade stuff. I don't know if because of the fact it was the 60809 chipset that they couldn't get as many developers up to speed and competent on it, whereas the 65.2, which was everywhere, very easy to kind of bounce from one machine to the other. Um, there wasn't a lot of the games that seem to be shown online for this machine aren't really official. Like they don't have a Donkey Kong. I forget what it's called. It's something else, but it's kind of an equivalent game. Same thing with a lot of the bigger and popular games at the time that were ported. They weren't licensed versions with the proper naming. They were the same gameplay on these machines, but using a different name. So that's another little interesting quirk I seem to have found, and I'm sure other people know this machine much better than I do. So they can certainly correct me in the comments of anything I say incorrect. And I will happily accept what they tell me because like I said, this is not a machine I personally owned in the 1980s or had a whole lot of experience. I just happened to find one floating around locally at a pretty reasonable price. So I figured why not grab it and just play with it a little bit. Unfortunately, it doesn't have a disk drive controller. I didn't get a tape drive. I got no cartridges. It's literally just the machine. So it kind of limits the kind of experimentation I can do with it because the minute you power it down, whatever you got's gone, right? Just like any of these machines, but if you don't have some sort of tape or disk storage system. Um, Other than that, I mean, I could ramble on probably for 20 minutes just with stream of consciousness, um, which I'm prone to do. But it seems, I would say it's a fairly decent machine for its era. It's got decent colors. It's got reasonable graphics. As you saw on the boot up screen, it does seem like the screen is a little um, squished. There's a whole lot of border, even for a CRT based machine. And remember, these were all CRT based. These were all designed to basically be hooked up to a television. So their real practical resolution is always limited to that. It's a limiting factor for all these machines because, like it or not, that's what they were designed to do. Because no one was thinking people are going to go out and buy monitors. We want them to be able to plug into their televisions that they have at home, and go. And many people did eventually buy monitors, but the original target market was just like your game systems. These are going to plug into your existing TV. You're not going to have to go out and buy another $200, display system to hook them to. So their effective graphics are limited to what's effectively useful there. It's not a bad system. I wish I had more stuff to do it. I have heard that the disk drive controllers go into the cartridge port, and there were some very faulty ones that don't handle too well. They haven't handled the test of time too well. I don't know the difference between that. That's just kind of secondhand things I've heard. The only real personal experience I ever had on a TRS-80 machine was actually not a Coco back in the day. I was on just a standard TRS-80 with the monitor and keyboard integrated, and then an external tape drive that I had probably in fourth, fifth, sixth, somewhere in there, fifth, sixth grade, seventh grade maybe, prior to getting a Commodore 64 personally. we had some TRS-80s at my school, um, and they were a completely different model. They were a completely different thing, which is another thing, that the color computer was a completely different design, a completely different model than the TRS-80s that came before it. It was not backwardsly compatible. Maybe at the basic level it was, but otherwise it was not. Um, but Tandy and Radio Shack had a lot of success with this particular with their computers. Don't underestimate them, even though they're not around anymore, and they don't have the attention or love that they once did, or that other players in this space, in this older retro area, seem to have. You know, the TRS-80 was kind of called the Trash 80 back in the day. It was like its nickname. Commodore was a Commodore, right? We call it Commode, and I forget we called Atari. Or I'm sorry, we called Apple, other than just grotesquely overpriced, which it kind of still is today. Um, Sorry, Apple, but you know it's true. $800 for a frickin' Mac Mini. You know it's true. Um, let's see. But Radio Shack had several models of the TRS-80, and they eventually got dropped the TRS-80, I think, completely, and just called these Tandy. They rebranded their entire computer brand as Tandy computers, and they existed into or manufactured computers into the IBM clone era. They were still making Tandys. I don't know when they finally stopped and sold in Radio Shack, and they had some reasonable success and were a player in this field. I never saw many Cocos. I saw a few, but not too many back in the day. Um, TRS-80s in my very youth, it was something I did occasionally see. Um, but the color computers, I never saw a whole lot of them. This is just personal anecdote. I know they sold them, and I know people bought them, but it wasn't something in fact, the first time I saw Coco legitimately in the wild is kind of an interesting story, and that was my former grandfather-in-law who was into um, shortwave radio and was using it as a terminal, using shortwave to broadcast messages back and forth over shortwave. He had a Color Computer 3. And the Color Computer 3 was the next, obviously, version after that, and it was a little more powerful. That one still gets a little more love, and I think if I was going to play around with these machines, I would probably shoot for the Coco 3 over the Coco 1 or the Coco 2. If it was my goal to put one in my collection. It's not. Like I said, I just haven't stumbled upon this one. But anyway, just some random thoughts on that. So, thanks.